No.
Oh, only pistachios.
All right.
Last time.
Your garbage cup. That's all right.
Thanks again to Shimon for bugging Binny enough for the food. So, yeah, sure. Just before starting this week, so I just wanted to say a quick ha'ara, something that Ari Schiff, who just he's been listening to the recordings just because he has a baby at home. But from last week, we had talked about the connection between Mordechai and language, and I invite you to go listen to elaborate more on that. But he just he reminded me of something that we perhaps should have mentioned, which is there's a midrash on Bigtan and Teresh that says they're whispering to conspire against the king, Achashverosh, and then Mordechai hears them, and he reports it. So the question is, why weren't they nervous that he understood what they were saying, or how did he overhear them? So again, it's not really so much of a question in the Pshat, but the Midrash says it's because Mordechai understood all 70 languages and he understood what they were saying.
That's the claim was that was the criteria to be accepted to Sanhedrin.
Exactly. So that was kind of one of the ideas that we developed in last week's shiur. So this was kind of another separate Midrash that we hadn't mentioned that supports that idea. So I just wanted to mention that Bishmo. Okay, I'm going to need the help of the larger group towards the end of the shiur to help me understand mechanical engineering, because katonti and something that one of the achronim develops I genuinely did not understand. But what I'd like to be talking about today is the Beit HaMikdash, and specifically the windows of the Beit HaMikdash and how they were designed. Chazal have a certain agenda, or they develop in the Midrash a certain interpretation of the windows of the Beit HaMikdash, and we'll see it through the lens of various Midrashim. And then we'll look at some of the Mefarshim to see how they kind of tackle the original psukim in Sefer Melachim, and then kind of there's a machloka between Girsaot, between Rashi and the Maharsha, and then the Ralbag comes in and asks quite a difficult question that we'll also look at as well. So it's actually it's a jam-packed week, hopefully, B'ezrat Hashem. So let's get started. So the context is the Gemara in Menahot and Daf Pevav Amud Bet. We've been going through Masechet Menahot and learning various midrashim. So from the Ein Yaakov. So the context here, and we're I guess 2 or 3 weeks late, but it's about the Menorah in the Beit HaMikdash. So the Torah says in Vayikra Chavtal, "Tzavet b'nei Yisrael v'ikchu elecha shemen zayit zach." Okay, famous pasuk. Amar Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani elecha v'lo li. Right, take for yourself olive oil. So for you instead of for me, lo leora ani צריך. Right? The God is saying, it's for you, the menorah. I don't need the light of the menorah. You need the light of the menorah. Okay? Shulchan b'tzafon u'menorah b'darom. The way it was laid out in the Mishkan and laid in the Beit HaMikdash was the shulchan was placed on the northern side and the menorah on the southern side. Amar Rabbi Zoika, Amar Rabbi Elazar, lo la'achila ani tzarich, v'lo leora ani tzarich. The Mefarshim say traditionally it's not like that, but they're placed next to each other because the goal of the menorah is to provide light for the table. But in the Beit HaMikdash, they were on opposite ends of the room, which isn't how you would normally place them. And that's to teach that you don't need the shulchan for eating. God does not need the shulchan for eating, and He does not need the menorah for light, but rather it's for our sake. And then this is the point that's important for us. Vayas labayit chalonei shkufim atumim. This pasuk is kind of the crux of the whole shiur. Right, when Shlomo HaMelech was building the first Beit HaMikdash, so Vayas labayit, he built for the Beit HaMikdash windows that were shkufim and atumim. Okay, and we'll analyze that. Tana, it was taught in the Braita, Shkufim מבפנים ואטומים מבחוץ, lo לאורה ani צריך. Okay, so they were shkufim on the inside, atumim on the outside, which teaches this refrain that we've been seeing a few times now from the Beit HaMikdash, that God does not need the light of the menorah. In a second, we'll explain why that helps understand why that is. Okay, and then just continues, Michutz laparochet ha'edut bo'al moed, edut hu l'chol ba'ei olam she'ashchina shora b'Yisrael. Right, the point behind all of this, if it wasn't clear yet, it's not that God needs a menorah or a table or anything else, but the goal behind having these utensils in the Beit HaMikdash is to provide a testimony for everybody in the world that the Shekhinah shora b'Yisrael. V'im tomar le'ora ani tzarich, and if you would think that God needs the light, v'alo kol 40 shana shalchu Yisrael b'midbar lo alchu ela le'oro. Right, just look no further than in the desert. Right, the opposite. Hashem provided the light for Bnei Yisrael while they were wandering. Ela edutu l'chol ba'olam sheshchina shora b'Yisrael. Ma eduta? What is the edut? Amarava ze ner ma'aravi shnotin b'shemen keneged chavrutea u'mimena haya madlik uva haya mesayem. And this is something about how the menorah was lit. You had the ner ma'avi in the middle, and they're all facing the middle. Less important for our purposes. So again, zooming in specifically to the idea of the windows were made shkufim and atumim. Why does that teach this larger message, which we understand? Lo laora צריך. So vayikra Rabba perek lamed aleph. Amar Rabbi Chanina, chalonot hayu levet hamikdash, umehem hayta ora yotz'a leolam. So there were windows in the Beit HaMikdash, and the light of the Beit HaMikdash went out to the world from those windows. Shne'emar vayas labayit chalonei shkufim atumim. Shkufot atumot, what does that mean? Hayu maktinot מבפנים umarchivot מבחוץ כדי להוציא אורה לעולם. The windows were narrow on the inside, and they were wide or broad on the outside. The idea being that the light from the Menorah, from the Beit HaMikdash, would go through the narrow part of the window on the inside, and then there would be some slope along the wall of the Beit HaMikdash, such that it would spread the light out in order to lehotzi ora leolam. Amar Rabbi Levi taught, Mashal lemelech shebana lo traklin v'asa chalonotav maktinot mibachutz umarchivot mibifnim kedei lachnis ora letocha. Rabbi Levi says, a parable, right? A king was building a palace. The way he would normally make his windows is that he'd make them narrow on the outside and wide on the inside. And the reason that he would do that is obvious, because his goal is to provide, to increase the light inside the room. Right? So obviously before electricity, you want to maximize the sunlight in the room. So you make it narrow on the outside, and then you have the slope broaden into the room so the light distributes and spreads out.
It's also a matter of defense, natural. If you have very narrow windows, you want to get a shot inside no matter what. Your chances of actually hitting right through the narrow space are pretty dim. It's really slim. So again, it's also a matter of defense.
But that's not how light works, though.
That's not how light works.
What? Either I'm missing something, or no. As in,
how does light work?
If you have a lamp on in your room, you've lit a fire.
Yeah.
How big or small the window is, it's not going to stop the light being in the room.
But
the question is the light going out. But
So
I
you want
agree
a bigger
that that's not how
window-
light
you want
works.
bigger more sun
in as
coming
much
in.
as
A
if you
small
have
window.
a small, let's say you have a small opening.
It doesn't
you have a small opening
maximize the
somewhere.
light.
If I start extending the wall in this direction, it's not going to give me more.
It's the same amount of light. The small hole is only going to let
The
inside
small
the
hole is still the small hole, and then
Okay. You guys are jumping. Good.
Or have
go.
light more
How does that make it more
concentrated.
light?
In other words, think of a magnifying glass. If you have it right over the side, over a black surface, what does it do? It burns. And if the light's more concentrated, then you have it.
Well, that would make it more intense. The question is, would it light up the room more?
if you have those lights, that outside lights on the side of the house that you can bend, you can turn the two bottom parts or top parts to make the light curve in different ways. The light's the same, but you move those flaps, and the light either spreads or it's contracted to like a smaller space. So it's the same, energy of light coming through, but either it's focused on one area or
Yeah, but you don't get more light out of it. What those flaps are doing,
you get more visibility in more places.
Yeah, but you block half the light to make it go to one place. So if you do that with a house and you have a small entrance going into your house and then make it big on the other side, you're not going to get any more light inside than if you had a small entrance and then...
It never mentioned anything about a small entrance. These could have been massive windows.
Right. I think so you guys are all asking exactly the right questions. But I think let's go with the assumption at this point of where things stand before we start asking all these questions, which I think is that if you have we're talking about the Heichal here. It's this massive, room, and I think, like David Moshe was saying, right, if you have the light directed coming from a narrow entrance, and then you have sunbeams coming, kind of, and filling that space, spreading out, that would maximize the light penetration in the room and light up the room in a more effective way. Or at least that's what this mashal is assuming. And so that is the logical way to do it if your goal is to light up the room. Aval chalonot shel Beit HaMikdash lo hayu ken. But the windows of the Beit HaMikdash were not like this. Ela maktinot mibifnim umarchivot mibachutz. It was exactly the opposite. That the widened opening was on the outside, and the reason for that is kedei lotzi ora gedola. And this explains lo laora צריך, because the fact that the windows are designed in a way specifically to maximize the light to leave the Beit HaMikdash, not to light up the Heichal, teaches me that God doesn't need the light of the Menorah, but rather that it's meant to be a literal and allegorical symbol of the light of the Beit HaMikdash spreading out into the world. Bamidbar Rabbah has the same teaching, but it kind of takes it one step further in terms of identifying God with light or a source of light. Right? Zeh shamar katuv, Hashem chafetz laman tzidko yagdil Torah v'yadir. Amar lo kadosh baruch hu leMoshe, lo bishvil shani tzarich lenerot hizartich al lenerot, ela lezakotam. I don't need the lights for myself, rather to give zchut to Bnei Yisrael. Shneimar unehora yimei shrei. It says in Daniel that light dwells with God. Uchtiv gam choshech lo yachshich mimakra v'layla kayom yair kachashecha ka'ora. Light dwells with God, right? There's this identification. It's a bit stronger than what we saw before. It's not just that God doesn't need the light because, of course, He's the divine and doesn't need something physical, but it's even more than that, is that God is constantly surrounded by and dwells with light. So, of course, He doesn't need the light of the menorah. Right? It's even more of an absurd assumption. He doesn't need that, okay? And then it continues and gives kind of a similar analysis to what we saw, so we can skip over that, but it's basically the same mashal. And then Psikta de Rav Kahana takes it one step further in Perek Chaf Aleph. So if you skip just to the third to last line, where it says Rav Berechia b'Shem Rav, at the end of the third to last line, it says Rav Berechia b'Shem Rabbi B'Tzela, Ktiv v'chalonot lo ve'ilamav. Okay, so this is from Yechezkel Perek Mem. So the last, from Yechezkel Perek Mem through the end of the Sefer, which I think is Mem Chet, it's a vision of Bayit Shlishi. At least that's the assumption, that's the common understanding. Okay, so Ela ka chalonot kehot hayu, atumot hayu, maktinot mibifnim achivo, מבחוץ כדי להוציא אורה לעולם. There's a drasha of the words in Yechezkel of the same idea, but in Bayit Shlishi, right? The windows, it's not just Bayit Rishon that we saw by Shlomo that had the windows like this, but also that idea is extended even to the third Beit HaMikdash in the future. We'll also have windows designed in this way. Okay, so we see here from various different midrashic sources, they add or tweak, but there is this general consistency about this idea that the windows were designed in that way. Before we get into kind of the mechanics and before we understand the machloket and the gersaot, let's go back quickly to the pasuk and analyze it, where it said 5 words: Vayas labayit chalonei shkufim atumim, tana shkufim mibifnim vatumim mibachutz. And there's kind of a simple question, without getting even complicated. There's a simple question that we can ask on this, in terms of what this tana assumes about the pasuk.
Ideas?
Any ideas? Yeah.
I guess you would think it's the opposite of transparency. That means whoever's already inside, if you like, the Kohanim, I guess the idea would be that they want them to see everything that's going outside and have the light that is inside shine outwards. But they don't want the people, the masses, being exposed directly to the Kodesh. So you have the opposite, if you like, the opposite of transparency. And you think of like an interrogation room where you have the one-sided window, one side can see what's going on inside. The opposite, the total opposite. Mm-hmm. So I think that's the idea in general.
Yeah, it's good insight. Yeah, definitely. Okay, so there's kind of this assumption that isn't stated explicitly, but when it says Tana shkufim mibifnim vatumim mibachutz, why do we assume that? Because the pasuk says the windows were made shkufim atumim, and we'll talk about what these words actually mean, but they mean narrow and broad. So why are we assuming narrow mibifnim, broad mibachutz? In other words, why couldn't it just says shkufim atumim, it doesn't say which direction. So Tana, it was taught, the direction was that it was broad on the outside and narrow on the inside. But why can't they just read the pasuk in Melachim to say, no, it was broad on the inside and narrow on the outside, just like all the other windows, just like the king in the mashal. Where does that assumption even come from?
Why are shkufim and atumim broad and narrow? Like, where else is it used to mean that?
Good, we'll get to that in a minute as well. That's what Rashi and the Marshal argue about. So there's 2 issues. One is, how do we know what shkufim and atumim mean? And the second is, assuming we know that they mean narrow and broad, how do we know that one is on the inside and one is on the outside? And which one to assign to which? So if you turn the page, so now we're looking at the commentaries on Nin Yaakov. So if you look at Harif, on the left side, 4 lines down, it says Tana. So he tries to give a linguistic hint to the teaching of Chazal. So he says, Tana שקופים מבחוץ ואטומים מבפנים. Okay, on line 5. יש להבין המינלן דילמה שקופים מבפנים ואטומים מבחוץ. Right, from the pasuk, I could just have easily have randomly assumed that it was narrow on the inside and narrow on the outside and broad on the inside. Why is the Gemara just assuming the opposite? Kanoach sheba'olam, the way that it's done everywhere else. V'nira dedayek bikra dehavale chalonot shkufim. Okay, so he says that really the pasuk should have said vayas labayit chalonot shkufim atumim, but it doesn't say chalonot; it says chalonei. Okay, so midichtiv chalonei shehu samuch l'shkufim. So now it kind of turns the phrase chalonim shkufim into chalonei shkufim. The shkufim is kind of describing directly the windows. Hachi ka'amar chalonei ashkufim. K'lomar b'makom hachalon שהוא רגיל להיות שקופים, דהיינו מצד פנים, באותו מקום הוא אטום. So, I think it's dachuk, but I wanted to bring it anyway. He's saying, the fact that it's chalonei shkufim, that teaches me that it's the opposite of the way windows are normally made, that's why it creates that conjunction. I think a stronger, or to me, a more compelling explanation is the Anaf Yosef, who doesn't bring a linguistic kind of support, but he brings more a contextual support. So if you look at the Anaf Yosef, which is the next source, on the bottom there in the same screenshot, so all the way on the right, it says, Chalonei shkufim atumim. Okay, so he says, Perush shkufim rechavim, right? The assumption is, and we'll get to this in a second, as John said, shkufim means broad, atumim means narrow. Mitzarech iyun, we have to understand, shkufim lachutz v'atumim bifnim, as we said, why not assume the opposite, like all other windows are made? So remember, the context here is the building of the Beit HaMikdash, okay? And this pasuk is brought at the very beginning of that discussion. So it's Menachem Aleph, all of Perek Vav and Zayin talk about Shlomo's construction, and the kind of the opening psukim have this pasuk, that he built the Beit Chalonei Shkufim Atumim. And so the Anaf Yosef suggests the following. היינו במאירי בסדר הבניין, שמחוץ להיכל, כמו שכתוב, ויבן יציע על כל הבית סביב להיכל ולדביר. Right preceding this pasuk, it talks about how he built something around kind of the outside structure of the Beit HaMikdash. It's kind of setting the stage for all of the details of the construction that would follow in the psukim. לכן יתפרש גבי החלונות תחילת דבריהם מבחוץ. היינו ויעש לבית חלוני שקופי מבחוץ. ואחר כך הוא אומר, אטומים היינו על כן לבפנים, צרות כאין אטומים. No, he argues that since the context is starting from the outside of the Beit HaMikdash, and then the way the psukim describe the construction, it kind of works in. So since it says shkufim atumim, the logical assumption is that shkufim is talking about outside, broad outside, and atumim, which is the next word, is talking about like from the out in, because that's the broader way that the construction is described.
Interesting. It's following the same direction.
Yeah, it's kind of like a within the pasuk. It's almost a microcosm of the description of the kind of the order that the building as a whole is described. So again, I think really what's motivating Chazal here is the message of Lo Laora צריך, and there's no reason to assume one direction more than the other. So to me, they're really just taking that opportunity to teach the message. But the Rif and Anaf Yosef are offering two different kind of approaches as to how to understand where they base that on. The second problem we saw was how do we know what shkufim and atumim mean? Okay, and here there's actually a machloket in the Girsah and the Gemara. So what we saw, if you actually go back here, I didn't realize this, it has the words מבפנים מבחוץ in brackets, and that's because according to Rashi those words are flipped. Okay, that Rashi's Girsah shkufim מבחוץ ואטומim מבפנים. And Rashi says as follows: מבפנים שהמשקופים של חלונות, היינו צר שבחלון, היינו מבפנים, והרוחב שבחלון מוחזק כלפי חוץ להוציא אורה לעולם. So Rashi, when he reads שקופים מבחוץ ואטומים מבפנים, now everyone agrees that the teaching of לא לאורה צריך has to mean that it's wide on the outside and narrow on the inside, but the question is, do you understand שקופים to mean narrow, in which case shkufim מבפנים makes sense. Shkufim מבחוץ makes sense. Or do you understand it to be the opposite? you have to be consistent with the end goal of lo l'ora צריך, that it's brought on the outside, but how you understand shkufim and atumim can change based on your girsa. The Maharsha says this in a clearer way in the next source, where he says, Vayas labayit chalone shkufim vatumim. Right? Tana shkufim מבחוץ וכולי, girsat Rashi. B'Gemara. Excuse me, sorry, I had it backwards. Rashi's girsa is the one that we have in the brackets. So Rashi says shkufim מבפנים, vatumim מבחוץ. Why? Because Rashi says, Uper shkufim milashon mashkof. Right? Ashkifa mimon kodshecha min hashemayim. So mashkof, like a thing that you look out of. So v'hu makom tsar, right? When you're looking out from something, you imagine you're on top of a wall, you're like the watcher is looking out from in between the minarets or whatever it is. So it's a narrow place that you're looking out from. Therefore, Rashi understands the word shkufim to be narrow, and if shkufim is narrow, okay, and then the Maharsha says v'lo yadana perush atumim lefi girsato. The Maharsha says it's very convenient. Rashi only explains what the word shkufim means, but I have no idea how he interprets atumim, because if shkufim means narrow, then atumim has to mean broad. And Maharsha says, I don't know where he gets the idea that atumim means broad. There's no source for that. But he says, aval afil girsatenu, but according to our girsa, where they switch it, the words nicha yeh shkufim milashon hashkafa v'istaklut. So the word shkufim comes from looking out, and then it's broad instead of narrow. Vatumim milashon atum u'mechuseh. Right? When something is atum, it means it's closed up, it's small and covered. Umashmele shkufim מבחוץ, and then I understand shkufim מבחוץ, broad on the outside, atumim מבפנים. And Rashi had shkufim, which was for him was narrow, and that would be מבפנים, vatumim מבחוץ. So the Maharsha is cholek on Rashi, and there's really two different girsaot, and in the Gemara you can see that there's even a comment that it kind of has that machloket girsaot that's retained in the Gemara based on this. But everybody agrees on the larger message. It's just about how I understand the words. Okay, all that was kind of the precursor for the part that I think is maybe the interesting piece. So before that, I just want to look at the Radak, who actually quotes Targum Yonatan. And Targum Yonatan traditionally, right, he's okay being midrashic and translating into Aramaic in a way that is kind of along the lines of Chazal. But if we see Targum Yonatan, p'tichan milegav v'stiman milevra, that Yonatan here, when he translates the pasuk, he says, Vayas labatim chalonei shkufim atumim, he says, p'tichan milegav, they were open or broad on the inside, v'stiman milevra, and they were closed or narrow on the outside. In other words, Targum Yonatan translates it not like all the midrashim that we saw, not like Chazal, but that the windows of the Beit HaMikdash were the way, according to the midrashim in the Mashal, the way windows were always constructed. And then the Radak just notes L'divrei Rabotenu zal behefech. Okay, and he is cholek on the words of the rabbis. Zeh shkufei atumim shkufim מבחוץ ואטומים מבפנים לא לאורה צריך. כלומר, רחבים היו מבחוץ וצרים מבפנים. They were broad on the outside and narrow on the inside. הפך מנהג העולם, לומר שאינו צריך לאורה העולם. And this is the opposite of the way it's the rest of the world. So we have already Targum Yonatan, who he's translating it in a way that is not in the way that Chazal understood it. Okay. The Ralbag comes, and right, we know Ralbag generally, right? Gersonides, he was of the Rishon. He was generally on the rational, had a rational bent to his approach to things, right? So he says as follows: Pirshu Chazal she'ayu rechavim mibachutz v'tzarim mibifnim. Right, the windows were broad on the outside and narrow on the inside. Lehorot she'eno tzarich leora, to teach that God did not need the light. Ela ki ze derech drash. And the Ralbag says, and this is a nice drash to teach this idea. Ki kvar hitba'er b'moftim handasiyim, because it's, and the reason this is only derech drash is because it's already been ascertained through right, mehandes, I guess, like engineering feats. Ki mipnei hayot chalonot rechavot mibachutz ve'olchot b'shipua yarbe yoter ha'or b'bayit k'mo sheniskar achar zeh. So Ralbag says that Chazal, they're wrong about the Metzius. In other words, if I have the window broad and then narrow, he says just technically the way that would actually increase the light on the inside of the room, rather than if I have it narrow and then broaden. And so he says that the way that the kings generally are doing it, according to Chazal, they make it narrow and then broaden, that actually would minimize the light that lights up the room. And so Ralbag says, according to Chazal, who say this teaches me, lo le'ora li tzarich, he says no, because the way Chazal say that the windows were built would actually maximize the light that came into the Beit HaMikdash, and therefore it doesn't teach the message of lo le'ora li tzarich, at least in the engineering sense. And so I think this is kind of what you were all alluding to a little bit, where, wait a minute, Chazal are kind of saying something that doesn't really kind of make sense with how we understand the science to work. I think you were also saying other things about it. It shouldn't make a difference, or I don't know. I mean,
Could be more time during the day that light will shine. There's more angles.
That makes more sense.
if it broadens on the inside,
No, if it's broader on the outside.
right? It'll kind of sweep the room.
No, it's not like a physical thing. Like it's not like a.
Yeah.
I don't know. Sure.
Oh, we could do like this, right? Don't worry.
Well, there are other areas where the Gemara deals with the idea of mikdash and light. For example, when they say that Mamunah says Balkai, when he asks He'ir Peiru Pnei Mizrach, you think of the whole we know that Hileni dedicated a nivreshet, which is a chandelier, to the Beit HaMikdash. What is the idea behind it? So, is there a lack of light? Does Mikdash need inside? Is it when you say Lo le'ora ni tzarich? Is it the candlelight or the olive oil light, if you like, or is it sunlight? Again, is it outside, inside? Where? What is the light that is needed? Who needs it?
Was there a roof to the Heichal?
And there's that. We know that the Midrashim speak of the in the end of first Beit HaMikdash. We know that the Kohen went up to the roof and threw the keys into the keys of Mikdash, and then threw himself into the fire when the Mikdash was already burning.
Uh-huh.
So again, that's first Beit HaMikdash.
Okay.
Now,
Because I know drawings I've seen in kind of children's books of the Beit HaMikdash, it's without a roof. And that might just be in order so you can see into the Beit HaMikdash.
by the way, if we just last week had Asara B'Tevet.
Yep.
Now, this is something that is the Lehavdil Elef Alfei Avdalot. When one of the biggest gatherings of the Nazi Party, they created something called the Cathedral of Light, where Albert Speer, the constructor, the minister of architecture in Nazi Germany, created an effect where he put over a large area of Nuremberg a light, big projectors that lit upwards, and gave the effect. It's all in the open, but it gave the effect of a closed area made out of light.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So you think of the effect you want to say, even if it doesn't have a roof. You want to give something that as if is it showing off light to the inside or outwards, and doesn't have a roof.
Mm-hmm.
So think of the effect and the idea behind it.
Right.
I think these, it's a good. It is a very good question.
Yeah, I know what rabbit hole I'm going down on YouTube tonight.
I spent some time trying to understand from a modern scientific perspective what the ideal way to build a window is to maximize light in a room, and I was not
size on both sides.
I was not able to find something that was clear to me in terms of what the answer to that. Everyone was talking about the type of material that you should use to the glass.
Yeah.
No one was talking about the angling.
I saw that at first.
I don't understand. This is what I was saying before.
Ask
maybe I
Shimon about
understood.
my Googling abilities. It's just going to be a few minutes.
I don't understand why you would surely not want the biggest surface area on both sides.
Have you asked
Meaning-
the AI chat
Oh,
GPT?
ChatGPT. I was ChatGPT.
Try that.
Oh, that's actually a good use case for ChatGPT.
Except that it's only taking stuff. from, like,
Homework. You have homework. Good.
Won't the answer be 42 or something like that?
What?
The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy.
Yeah.
knows its stuff.
The question, I think it's, I was going to say, there's also the midrash about the Atid level. When Mashiach comes, he goes up to the roof of Bet HaMikdash and says, Anavim megi'ah zman geulatchem.
Yeah, look at the base of it.
Again,
Right.
how do you understand
Yeah,
that?
I don't know about the roof. I just
Again,
seared into my memory are the pictures from the book. I'm sure there's, maybe there was a roof. I don't know. It was just toheh. Okay, so good. Homework, we're going to get an answer from ChatGPT on what today's science has to say.
I would say this is a good indication that there was a roof.
Right. I mean, you would assume, right?
Otherwise, those windows are going to help.
They're not going to help much. Again, unless I don't have a problem with the Ralbag's assertion that this is derech drash. In other words,
For sure.
Chazal are not necessarily interested in the engineering or mechanics behind this as much as to teach a lesson about the goal of the menorah, right? And so, in that case, the Metziut doesn't really, I mean, I'm okay with kind of the idea of that not really being what's driving them, even though that's their starting point. But we still do need to understand, because they do say mashal, melech, and it's the opposite. It's clear that they had some assumption about the science behind this. Other homework for anyone who's more kind of inclined to not just get an answer from a chatbot is this Chidushei Geonim, where he goes on, and I for the life of me I could not understand what he was saying. He goes on to defend Chazal on the level of the Metziut, to say, and he has language here. He has language here that was very strong that I actually really liked. If you go to that second column from the right, okay, so not the first column on the right, the second column on the right, and you go down maybe 10 lines or so, you say where it says, Aval Ralbag katav al divrei Razal, ki zeh derech drash, right, we saw this, ki kvar hitbaer b'moftim handasiyim, כי מפני היות רחבו מבחוץ והולכו בשיפוע הרבה יותר האור בבית, עד כאן לשונו. And he says, באמת הוא, המופתים ההנדסיים הם ודאים בתכלית הוודאות, אבל אי אפשר שהרלב"ג יהיה חכם גדול יותר מרז"ל. Okay, so he says it can't be the Ralbag is smarter than Chazal, right? וכן מה שכתוב הוא דרך דרש, and the fact that he says that what Chazal said is only דרך דרש and not based on the מציאות, לא ידעתי אם אצלו דברי דרש הם דברי שקר, ודברי חכמי עליהם השלום הם אמת. In other words, he is saying, is the Ralbag saying that Chazal are lying? In other words, okay, you can say it's derech drash, but they're still grounded in the engineering truth behind the point here, and he's saying the Ralbag can't just say, oh, derech drash, but it can't be like that, right?
Do you think the assumption here is that Chazal wouldn't be wrong about scientific matters, or do you think the assumption
They were
is
wrong
like
about a lot.
things? No, I know, but I'm not asking. I'm not asking whether that's what Shimon Merfeld thinks. I'm asking.
So two things. It could be Chidushei Gonim
that,
at a certain hashkafa.
Or is it that we're looking at something that's like
Obvious,
it's
right?
Observable to them.
Exactly. Right. Exactly. So it could either exactly. So there's two ways to interpret this to me. One is that he has a certain hashkafic perspective on the fallibility or lack thereof of Chazal, even in matters of science. Or you can say, even if he holds that Chazal can be not necessarily correct in terms of matters of science, but this is something that's so obvious. In other words, and the fact that they are addressing
it's observable.
It's observable, and it's not something that, okay, modernity had to come along and kind of teach you whether when you're building a room and you go this way or this way, which one is more light. That's something that Chazal shouldn't have gotten wrong, right? Mm-hmm. So either way, I think you could understand this. And basically the crux of his argument, he goes on and on about how he consulted with all these kind of engineers in his day and all these Rabbanim, and he got kind of the okay, and he also the experts in the field of his day said that he understood it better than the Ralbag, and his basic idea is that there's, if you go to the third column from the left, where it says, Da ki nitzotzei haor lashlicha bina. Da ki nitzotzei haor. It's about 7 lines down. The last word on the line is da. I'll just read down a few lines here. Da ki nitzotzei haor hem mishnei panim. There are two types of sparks of light. Harishon or yashar v'hasheni or chozer. That you have light that is just a light beam, and then you have light that's refracted. Okay? Optics. And he essentially, what he then goes and argues for the next 2 columns is that because it's on a slant, so there's a certain kind of refractive effect that the Ralbag wasn't taking into account. I don't understand the technicality of his argument behind the optics. So I would love if someone wanted to enlighten me on that. But his basic argument is that really Chazal were correct in the actual science of it and in the observability of it, and the Ralbag was the one who was incorrect, in order to try to salvage Chazal, not just in the sense of Drash, but even in the sense of Pshat.
Maybe its windows act as a prism.
Yeah. So I mean, I have no idea, and I'm not good at physics, but I hadn't thought of it until now. We're talking about like a really thick glass that's going like this, or like yeah. So that definitely could the way the light is refracted definitely could be affected by the angles.
Oh, so good. That's the Malbim here. The Malbim says, right, that they were made of glass. Historically, glass wasn't available in the times of Bayit Rishon. It was invented later. So, kasha. But, yeah.
Well, you got to remember the two bigger issues, if you like.
Yeah.
Who were the architects?
Well, they weren't Jewish necessarily. It was,
have the first Beit Mikdash was
So, yeah.
Hiram
Yeah.
and Sol,
And then Herod.
which we all know that the Freemasonry has made his image much bigger, amplified his the whole idea, the whole concept of the first Beit Mikdash as an ideal far greater than what they had initially thought. And the second one,
But they didn't have glass windows.
מי שלא ראה בניין הורדוס, לא ראה בניין יפה מימיו.
Yeah, of course.
In other words, non-Jews were involved in actually thinking of how it should look.
Right. Why would that affect, though, the answer? How does that affect the answer to the question of the optics behind it? Just that there was kind of worldly input in the day?
Because, you think of who were the masterminds of the Klei Mikdash back in the Midbar.
Don't wrong.
Right.
People of our people.
Yeah.
Betzalel Ben Uri,
Right.
and so on.
Previous
No,
updates
Aliav.
saving them.
Okay? Now you have Hiram,
Even the
and you have,
which means it was saving it.
okay?
Yeah.
So, in other words,
UI.
is the whole idea of the architect, because, being an architect, it's a form of art.
Right.
In other words, you also say, are you letting someone from the outside dictate the ideals or how because, you read stuff that architects, they analyze stuff today. So they say, okay, there's the dry, physics and mechanics of the idea, and there is what I want, what's the ideal, or what do I want to say in what the building, the bridge, the street, how do I want the city to look?
Right.
In other words, what are the values that are, emanate from the creation? So you'd ask, okay, do you want outsiders dictating the values? Again, it's a question. Because you're asking, the light, what's the idea? Is it just a matter of how many photons I have in the area, or is it a question of what is the ideal that I am, or the idea behind it that I want Beit HaMikdash to portray inwards, outwards, etc. Just a thought.
Additional thought.
Yes.
Glass as glass may not have existed,
Right.
but precious stones did. So maybe.
What, a whole wall
Window
of
is-
precious stones for windows?
Well, how many were there? Do we know how many there were?
Maybe not glass, but think of it this way: what was the outer mizbeach made of?
What was that?
Copper,
The outer
copper
mizbeach.
mirrors.
The claim was it was made out of the marot tzovot.
Correct.
Right.
There was copper that you polished very
Exactly.
looking.
That means it gives you some kind of mirror image.
Yeah, but that's not helpful for light.
It's
coming
not
through.
glass. It doesn't have to be glass, but it gives you
Yeah,
some
but
kind
that
of mirror
doesn't
image.
help you for looking through. It's a shiny surface.
Okay.
Doesn't
Again,
have light in.
so if we were speaking of an idea of a prism, in other words, you have an opening, or if it's wide or narrow, it doesn't matter, and you have some kind of a mirror effect, amplification of the light coming in from the outside. Again,
Some
Yeah,
material that the window is open. In this case, the window is open, but there's some kind of material that's reflecting the.
well,
the light
yeah.
off of it.
Think of the invention of at least the claim, the invention of Archimedes in the war against the Romans, where he tried to use some kind of at least that's what the historical claim is, that he tried to use the sunlight in order to burn the ships of the Romans. So he used and the idea was, okay, so
Really
he used
big
some form of, again. So you use enough mirrors, so maybe or either you can direct sunlight or amplify sunlight in some way, shape, or form. Another idea was that in Egyptian temples, you found again this idea also of sunlight coming in from the outside, and then using some kind of form of mirrors to amplify the light inside the temple. Another neat trick.
Interesting. Possibility. I was just thinking in terms of like precious stones, like the soar for the teva. It's not glass, but it functions as, depending on what interpretation you take, as some kind of a window-ish thing. So
Right.
According to ChatGPT, it
Over there?
doesn't make a difference. You can't increase the amount of sunlight coming in the room.
Hold up, thank you very much.
However,
Verified by robots 40 minutes later.
however, upon pressing further,
Oh, okay. Also, ChatGPT is always right. Just
the transmittance of
even
a
put that
window,
disclaimer at the beginning.
the fraction of light that is transmitted through the window. In general, that's determined by the properties of the material of a window, if there is one. The shape of the window can also affect the transmission. It goes back on its original, but this is usually a secondary factor compared to the materials. But it doesn't. I need to dig further into it and press it.
Ask the
further.
specific question, right?
No,
But
you could.
That does make sense. What he's saying is, meaning, I think, it wouldn't make a difference, again, it
The
depends on
direction
what
of
we're
the-
talking about, but like, if you're thinking a window the way I was thinking of it originally, which is a hole in the wall, it doesn't make a difference whether, the hole is like this or like that or whatever. It's kind of just, that point is how much, will determine how much light gets in. But if you're thinking of the window as a piece of glass or a piece of some other, translucent or reflective material, then I guess it can, because it determines how the sun is bouncing off of it.
The only thing I'm thinking of is if you're from lighting for, let's say, in drawing, when you're trying to draw light, if you had if you were drawing the inside of a room that had a massive exterior part, it was a huge brick wall, and the outside was massive, but it comes down to a tiny thin crack. When you're drawing the light coming in, the sunlight, let's say it's coming directly, will be a thin ray of light coming through that. Mm-hmm. However, if you had it the opposite, it would be spread out throughout the room, even though it would be the same amount of light and it would be much dimmer, the light coming in, but it would go further. So that perception could be seen as bringing in more light.
Yeah, because light doesn't necessarily move in a straight line. It's waves.
Correct.
And that's, again,
Does that make sense?
that's
You're arguing for Chazal's understanding.
Meaning they're using the term more light inaccurately. Like, it seems to be more light, but it's
Right.
not actually. It's just spread out more. And
Right, the number
and
of
Ralbag is
photons might
saying
be- right.
It's actually brighter where it's shining, right? It's the same amount of light,
Right.
but it's more focused. But that's missing the mark. That's not the perception of light coming in and its usefulness, right?
Right,
Does that make sense?
right.
Because it definitely would be easier to see more if it was coming in the inside more broad and the outside more narrow.
That's Chazal. Yeah, that's the Chazal's
It would
assumption.
definitely, you would see more in the room if that was your only source of light. You would see more of the room. It would be more useful. No, I'm serious.
Yeah,
Okay. So I think it's simple.
all right. Here's my proposal. Next week we'll come back with a full answer from ChatGPT
Okay.
on the science of it, and someone will understand the last kind of 3 columns of Chiddushei Gonim and enlighten me. Pun intended. Shkoyach. Thank you very much.